I'm very pleased to be chairing this discussion, DRIP by DRIP, have we given up on privacy? Can I just ask you all to turn off your mobiles so that if any of you are being surveilled, then the surveillors will know that the debate is about to start and we won't be interrupted. I'm not going to say too much because I think this is quite a well-trodden ground and it's kind of an issue that we all know of and that we're going to try and tease out today. I suppose the obvious point is just that we live increasingly in a world, and we live increasingly our lives and large parts of our lives digitally and online and through increasingly sophisticated means of communication. And obviously thanks to Snowden's revelations last year and ongoing revelations about phone hacking by journalists, and then given the elasticity of the RIPA Act, phone hacking by police on journalists and all this kind of stuff, we've kind of really been confronted recently with the extent to which our data is open to snooping and prying. And so obviously one question is, I guess, how concerned should we be about that? You could obviously learn a lot about me, and indeed we could all learn a lot about each other if we had access to each other's mobile phones, your contact list, your text messages, your email messages, your banking, your passport, your everything. So in a sense, we have all this information that may be snoopable and readily available, and that could be important. But it may also be that, with all due respect, I'm not very interested in most of your information, and most of us are not very interested in each other's information. And I suspect even the security services are not that interested in my information. So there's one question is, do we actually have anything to really concern ourselves about with this? I think the obvious tension, and this is something that came up, I thought, quite interesting in the last session on negotiating online relationships, particularly around children. The obvious tension that we have is that on the one hand, we are all, for perhaps good reason, concerned about privacy and our data and our communications online, whilst at exactly the same time, we all reveal voluntarily an awful lot about ourselves online through social media, through our texting, and if you're in government, through your sexting behaviour. So there's a question there, not just about the kind of regulatory implications, but about how we approach the question of privacy and the control of our own data, and whether that privacy is important to us and whether it should be important to us. And we have, I think, a very good and interesting panel to tease out some of the issues today. So if I introduce them in the order that they're going to speak. On my far left is Phil Booth, who is coordinator at Med Confidential, which campaigns for confidentiality and consent in health and social care. He formerly led No to ID, which campaigned very long and hard and ultimately very successfully against the introduction of ID cards and other aspects of the database state. And his campaigning work has led him to receive awards and recognition by Privacy International and Liberty. So you can see why he is a very important and appropriate person to have kicking off the discussion today. Speaking second next to Bill is Jennifer Betts, who is Research Assistant at the Centre for Secure Information Technology at Queen's University Belfast, where she's researching regulation, privacy and trust issues as part of a large EC-funded project. And she's also completing her doctoral studies on the questions of privacy and trust in relation to security and critical infrastructure threats. And Jennifer says in her biography that she's a great advocate of cross-disciplinary research. So I think we have an ideal cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary panel, so Jennifer should feel very much at home. On my right-hand side is Stephen Dedman, who is Group Privacy Officer and Head of Legal for Privacy, Security and Content Standards at the Vodafone Group. And I'm delighted that Stephen is here for one reason, because Vodafone are very generously sponsoring this strand in this session, so it couldn't be taking place without them. But more importantly, I'm delighted Stephen's here, if I can say that, because he brings a particular expertise to the topic of how we negotiate and navigate questions of privacy and our online and digital existence, having worked around these issues a lot over the past 15 years. And along with many plaudits and awards for his work, earlier this year, Stephen led Vodafone's publication of the first global law enforcement disclosure report, which makes really quite fascinating reading, and I suspect, I don't know if you're going to talk about it directly, but it's certainly a kind of key part of this discussion about how information providers navigate quite a difficult relationship and pressures between consumers and states and regulation. Speaking next is Dr. Natasha McCarthy, who's Head of Policy at the British Academy, and previously she was Director of Education at UCL's Department of Science, Technology, Engineering and Public Policy. Like Stephen, Natasha comes from an organisation that is sponsoring events this year at the Battle of Ideas. So we're delighted to have her with her kind of British Academy hat on, but also because Natasha has done a lot of work and quite influential work and report writing around the issue of technology, science, expertise and privacy to do with data and analysis. And then finally, we have Professor Bill Derody, who has returned to the UK recently to become Chair of International Relations at the University of Bath. Over the past few years, Bill has been Head of Conflict Analysis at Royal Roads University in Victoria in British Columbia, a Senior Fellow at the School of International Studies at Nanyang University in Singapore, and a Senior Academic at the Defence Academy in the UK and at King's College London. He's the author of War on Terror or the Search for Meaning, which is a contribution to the 2013 US Joint Chiefs of Staff Defence White Paper, which was seeking to reevaluate counter-terrorism strategies in light of events in Boston and elsewhere. So we're delighted to have Bill on the panel to tease out some of the international issues, the issues to do with terrorism and security. So can we please give our panel a very warm welcome. They're each going to speak for about 5 minutes. We'll have a quick discussion up here, and then it's going to be over to you to raise some points and interventions and comments and questions. So, Phil, can I ask you to kick us off, please?
So, as James has laid out, I don't think there's any doubt that we face ongoing onslaughts of attacks and erosions of our privacy. But have we given up? Well, no, not in my experience over the last 10 years of campaigning. Certainly the last couple of years working in the particular area of our medical records, our health information, and increasingly our genomic information, many people do care deeply about this, and this is something that does activate people to take action which maybe in other areas of their life they don't. I think it's really important that we make some distinctions, though. As James said, when I was doing No to ID, we focused on the database state. I think it is something we should be wary of just merging the two and saying, oh, well, this all in together. There are things that we choose to do and can choose to do. And then there are those things that we are actually compelled or coerced into. And there are some things which only the state can do. They can pass laws, they can lock you up, they can deny you benefits. So while some may feel peer pressure, while it may be a sort of a new negotiation in teenage life, you know, what you do about participating in social networks, there is no legal obligation that you are on Facebook or Twitter or any of them, and neither is there an obligation for you to perform anything other than a public persona. Yes, lots of people do put lots of crazy stuff up there, but it's quite possible to just perform on there. And frankly, when some of these networks do become uncool and people move on, and certainly young people, I think, have migrated en masse in recent years from Facebook and moved into other networks and apps like Snapchat and other ones, and there are some offerings now which you know, purport at least to offer privacy options, whether Whisper actually turns out to be as private as it says. People will move around. People are finding ways. The market may even be beginning to throw up things which help. So what's more worrying, I think, is what Michael Frumkin has called privacy myopia. It is just almost impossible for the individual, for the consumer, to determine the value of the data that they are surrendering, whether it be personal data, behavioral data, or what have you. And this, I'm not sure, is this is a massive imbalance, but I'm not sure whether it is some sort of market failure or whether it's actually a property of the system. The fact is that those little bits of data only get sort of only have aggregate value at the network level. Yeah, so the economic imbalance is there. Now, if the market we're talking about is something that Norman Lewis down in Brighton the other week called SMS, sell more shit, then caveat emptor. If you're not paying for it, you are the product. But what's more sinister, and what I think most people are concerned about, is when government not only permits or licenses this sort of activity, but actively gangs up. And we've seen several Home Secretaries, certainly the ones I've been campaigning under, who've demonstrated a sort of surveillance envy about what the commercial sort of sector can do. So 2 other things quickly in my 5 minutes. First is it's very important, again, to note they are not just watching. This is all about various forms of control. Yeah, and an attack on privacy is undermining autonomy, I would say. It's not always overt, it's not always that panopticon-like suppression, but it may be the drip, drip, drip of normalization, of that pressure to conform. And that itself can contribute to these sort of feelings of sort of helplessness or general infantilization in society. What can I possibly do? What I'm also concerned about is this persistent obsession with prediction. Confusing correlation with causation, patterns in data with truth, crowd dynamics with individual human behavior. And it's stuff like this that at policy and individual level starts leading towards creepy things like nudge. I'm sure you've all heard of the behavioral insight team, just recently part privatized, and maybe of the Facebook contagion experiment, where it's not just looking at people, it's actually actively intervening in their lives. And we have ethics around that. But at the far end of this does actually result in outright discrimination. My final point that I really, really want to make is about trust. Because fundamentally, and this is what we've been fighting in the sort of Medical Confidentials campaign, if you can't, or if someone won't keep your secrets, you lose confidence in them. It's a fairly simple dynamic. And so when people are forced to surrender things, your secrets, that you have shared with them, sensitive information, things like that, you actually start to really corrode the trust absolutely necessary to the relationships that we have to have in society. Medical confidentiality is one of those fundamental things. If we undermine it, if we crash trust, this is going to have devastating consequences. Now, we've been working to engineer ways in which things can be done consensually, safe, and transparently, and I'm sure we're going to talk more about transparency. But if we don't spend the time, spend the effort, spend the money, confidentiality costs, I'm afraid we'll pay an even higher price if we give up on privacy.
Thank you, Phil.
Thank you.
I've got 3 questions, really. Are we less protected following Snowden's revelations? Now that we're more informed about what the government are doing to protect us, 55% of Americans think that Snowden did the right thing. I've carried out some research. What I actually did was look at the comment streams following the articles in The Guardian and on the BBC websites to see what people's attitude was to this issue. It was like a huge focus group with the politeness all gone. So you've got Americans thinking Snowden did the right thing, but you've also got it's opposed by the I've got nothing to hide, so I've got nothing to fear group, which they've got a point, but Daniel Solov has been writing about this for a long time. He wrote a seminal essay on it. I've got nothing to hide, and other misunderstandings of privacy. The other thing, people do want to protect themselves, but what I found was there was such a gap in knowledge. There were people who were either very interested in technology and had a lot of knowledge. There were engineers joined the debates, and then there were the ordinary people. The engineers were offering them solutions. They were saying, use DuckDuckGo, don't use normal websites, and so on. And people were saying, I don't know what you're talking about. And they would even try to lay it out for them and explain, and they'd still say, I can't do that. People just want to use the internet. And a lot of the time, they're prepared to give up some privacy to get the services. I think there was a huge amount of lack of trust in government, which manifested in different ways. It wasn't just about this issue. People brought in the scandal about the MP's expenses, parliamentary expenses, and so on. So there's a lack of trust out there, but at the same time, some people said, but they're protecting us and we're prepared to give up our privacy for that protection. So I think we've got to decide what we want, and do we have the knowledge to know what we want? That is maybe a bigger issue, because there is such a... it used to be that there was a worry that people didn't have access to the internet. Now there's a huge gap in whether they understand they have access, but they don't understand. Some of the remarks by the engineers and people interested in technology was very scathing and kind of serves just to shut down that conversation, really. People are more or less told they're stupid, so they're not going to ask questions that need to be asked. So what's being done? Well, in Europe, the data protection, long overdue and long awaited data protection legislation, the right to be forgotten, for example, it's been hotly debated, but actually the courts jumped the gun really on it and said, yes, you have the right to be forgotten. So now Google are trying to be the judge and jury. They're making a judgment call on taking people's information off. But I see the information out there. If you think of the analogy of gossip, you don't know where your information is, who has it, what they might do with it. One of the things that came out of the research I did was people are very anxious about the fact that there is so much known about you now, which is fine. What you've been looking up on Amazon tells an awful lot about you. They probably have better profiles about us than the government do. And what's okay, being of a political persuasion, a religious group, sexual orientation, those things that might be fine now, in 10 years' time, there may be a whole new social attitude, regime, and so on. So people are very concerned that that information's out there. But even if we have the right to be forgotten, it's stored on people's computers. It's everywhere. It's like gossip. You can't bring gossip back. You can't say, I don't want that to be out there. It's out there. I've been working on a critical infrastructure protection programme with the EU and FP7 project. And I was kind of almost a bolt-on because my background's in sociology. So I'm working with engineers who use a lot of jargon. I mean, they talked about GUIs, GUIs, and I said, look, guys, to me, that's the Golfing Union of Ireland. And I'm sure that's not what you're talking about. But we went for our first-year review of the project. It's a 3-year project. And the commissioners told us that unless we addressed ethics, privacy, and trust, the funding would be pulled, no matter how successful the project was. And they said they'd had a very successful project that they had pulled the funding from because they hadn't addressed these things. Okay, so I'm back to really what Phil was saying. Trust is a big issue for legislators as well as for business, and as well as for all of us, really. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. Stephen.
Thank you. I'm conscious that as I'm speaking here across London in Hackney, there's a showing of Laura Portas's documentary, Citizen 4. And if I wasn't here, this is the documentary that she made as she and Glenn Greenwald met Edward Snowden in Hong Kong, and they recorded those first moments where he revealed the information he had about the NSA. And if I wasn't here, I'd be there because it's the only chance I'm going to get to watch that film. And it's showing across the UK. There's also another play in London at the moment called The Internet is Serious Business about the anonymous hacker collective. And earlier in the spring, there was a play at the Donmar about privacy as well, talking about some of the things we've just talked about on the panel. And even Banksy's turned his eye to this with an installation in Cheltenham, shining a spotlight on the issue of surveillance. And what this tells me is that once artists and playwrights start turning their attention to something that has for many years been obscure, such as surveillance and privacy, then it's entered a new space in the public consciousness. And I think we have Edward Snowden to thank for that. Now, for me personally, I've been working on the question of surveillance as it affects a company like mine, we're a telecoms company. We operate across the world in many, many countries. And as a condition of being in business, we have to work with governments to give them information about your communications. That's the rules of being in business. And so my company and a number of other companies came together back in 2005 to debate the dilemma that places us in, when essentially what we want to do is to ensure that our customers trust us and use our services, knowing that they can speak freely, they can communicate with who they want, and they can do so in private. And it puts us in a very difficult position. It was only when Edward Snowden came forward with his revelations that this became such a big public issue that we felt we needed to come out and speak very publicly about this issue. And the report that James referred to earlier, it was the culmination of that, and we published that in June. And I'm going to talk about that and tell you a little bit about the justification and why we did it and what the key messages were that we were trying to get out there. So Snowden's made this subject of surveillance and particularly the role that the technology industry, the communications companies, the internet companies play in helping governments to track you and monitor you and understand what people are doing for purposes of law enforcement or intelligence gathering. Our report wants to put that, the context in which that takes place into the public domain so people can understand why it happens, how it happens, and some of the challenges that we face and governments are facing in many parts of the world. So the first thing I want to say is there's often a suggestion that the way companies work with governments is sort of complicit and kind of voluntary, that we just choose to kind of give them information because they come asking for it. The reality is that our economic intent, never mind the ethics of all this, and I completely agree with Phil, this is an important ethical issue, and we're lovely people at Vodafone, but the economics of this are that it's in our economic interest to make sure that people can communicate as freely as they can and as confidently as they can, which means as privately as they want to. If they don't do that, they won't use our services. What they'll do is they'll use someone else's services, someone else they think is going to be more respectful of their privacy, more respectful of their data. Because you're all our customers and you pay us, and if you don't like what you get from Vodafone, you'll quickly go to O2 or somebody else. Our business is built on trust. So everything we do is about trying to maintain that trust, and trust, we know from our own studies, forces people to leave services they don't trust. And so that's what we're trying to do. But, as I said at the beginning, in every single country in which we operate, every single one, the law requires us to work with governments. We can't be in the country, we can't run a network, we can't provide services without doing that. And our report laid that out by explaining specifically what the legislation is so you can see it for yourselves. And this doesn't just happen on a kind of an ad hoc basis. It's not small scale, it's industrial scale. And some of the numbers that we revealed in our report show this is big stuff. It's not just individuals dealing with the occasional request from a law enforcement authority. We have dedicated teams, systems, infrastructure, churning out this stuff so governments can get access to information that they're legally entitled to under the laws of this country and many other countries. So it places us between a rock and a hard place. We want to be respected and trusted by our customers, but we're forced to do things that in many ways are legitimate on behalf of governments, but clearly the public and many stakeholders are now asking lots of questions about. One of the things that was really interesting about our report was the reaction around the world in governments. Many parliaments around the world had debates about the report because we were revealing information about their countries that many politicians in those countries were completely unaware of. There were debates in India, in Ireland, in Germany, the Netherlands, where politicians were saying, do we really have these laws? Who's using them? How are we using them? How frequently are we using them? And that's a really worrying thing to hear when politicians are asking these sorts of questions. So the amount of understanding, not about the detailed technical stuff, just the basic things, the laws that the governments and their agencies are using is very poorly understood by our political leaders. And when you look at those laws are incredibly opaque and they're very old. And of course, technology is very new. So we've got a problem of new technology and old laws. Now, the title of this session refers to an emergency piece of legislation that was rushed through in the summer called DRIP. That builds on another piece of legislation called the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, which goes back to 1999. And I remember when that piece of legislation was being negotiated in Parliament because I was involved in lobbying on it. And it was controversial, but what they didn't understand at the time was that technology would change radically over the next 15 years. What you used to do in 2000, if you wanted to communicate, it was make a phone call, send a text message, and possibly an email. Today, there's a plethora of ways in which you can communicate. And most of the services that you're using have been completely decoupled from networks like ours, so you can use WhatsApp or Snapchat or Facebook or any other number of other things. And most of the data that you're generating is being hosted somewhere else around the world. And so this is not just a kind of a national problem. Governments are trying to get their hands around a national problem, but really it's an international problem because the world in which we operate, the companies and the services that you're using are international and they're spread around the world. And what the government in this country has tried to do is try to address that in this new emergency piece of legislation. Our point is actually that this needs a complete review. The law we have in this country and every other country we've looked at is radically out of date and not fit for purpose. We need not to do patchwork legislation on top of an existing failing system. What we need is to look at this from the ground up and completely review the way we look at the legitimacy of those powers, the levels of transparency provided to the public and to parliaments, and the degree of oversight and accountability that's provided. Theresa May said in her speech at the Conservative Party conference just a few weeks ago that there's a crisis in national security created by the rapidly declining ability of the police and security services to monitor internet and phone use. So there's definitely a lot of changes taking place, and in a very narrow sense, it is changing the way that surveillance takes place. But we can't deny the fact that there's a massive explosion in data and connectivity and information about every single element of your life that's available not just to the security services, but to companies and app developers and so on. And that's completely changed the nature and the lens through which we have to look at surveillance. So one of the things we call for in our report is a complete change and a review of the legislative framework that enables governments to carry out and conduct surveillance.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Natasha.
Yeah, thanks very much. That's very interesting, actually, because I think there's some similarities between what Stephen's just said and what I'm going to say. But I'm quite interested from the sort of societal side and the dilemmas that society faces. So, as Jim said, my kind of area of interest is the relationships between society and technology and how society responds to technological change, how societies adopt technologies, and how technology designers kind of respond to the needs of society. And I've worked on a lot of issues, but one of the very first things I looked at was privacy and surveillance. And back in around 2005, 2006, I was working with the Royal Academy of Engineering on a report called Dilemmas of Privacy and Surveillance. And we called it dilemmas for a good reason that I'll come to, but we actually started off calling it keeping Big Brother at bay, and it just became obvious that keeping Big Brother at bay was just too hard, and we'd have to look for some sort of middle ground between some sort of surveillance and the benefits it brings and the kind of costs that we might experience as a result. So I'll talk a little bit about what we looked at back then, what we failed to see, and what's changed, and come back to the question at the end of whether in the intervening time we actually did give up on privacy. So we had a set of engineers and social scientists working together on a set of questions. One of the questions was, what is privacy? What is privacy? What's identity? What is it to identify somebody? What is it to collect data? What is personal data? All these questions were quite complex, overlapping, interrelated. There are no straightforward answers. And if you're going to have something like a Data Protection Act that talks about protecting someone's private life, what is a private life? What is private? What does that mean? So we asked questions like that. We asked if we could design for privacy. Can you design a system such that people get the benefits of sharing, but they also get their data protected and they have their own personal lives protected? Is that possible? Can we do that? We asked the question which Stephen just talked about, can the law keep up with technology, or can it be technologically neutral? Is that a possibility in this area? And we also talked about reciprocity between the people who manage technologies and the people that collect data and the subjects of those data. So can you have some sort of kind of quid pro quo between the subject and the data user? And we said a few things in that report that I thought were quite interesting and have come to bear. So, for example, the main point of the report was that we saw a massive rise in kind of data collection technologies, either things that deliberately are used to collect data or by chance happen to, as a byproduct, to collect lots of data. We saw a massive rise in technologies that process data. So, for example, we've had a big rise in the use of contactless payments. So there was much more kind of data following the way we buy things. We've obviously had a lot more ways of paying for things like travel in a contactless, cashless way, which obviously creates a data trail. We looked at things like algorithmic trading that has become quite prevalent in stock markets, which takes advantage of these fantastically powerful data processing technologies. We looked at the kind of development of Wi-Fi and 3G, the fact that we can be connected anywhere, we can give data away all the time, we can tell people where we are, what we're doing all the time. But we also made predictions about what kind of legal issues and policy issues might arise out of these technologies. We were concerned that police might kind of design their powers on the basis of the technology and the kind of opportunities technology gives rather than on what people's rights are and responsibilities are. We were worried that legislation would be created without a proper debate about privacy and a proper understanding of what technology can deliver. And we also saw that individuals would be a source of surveillance as well as the state. And whilst our main focus is on the state and policymakers, we were worried slightly about individuals. But what we didn't foresee is probably the most significant thing that's happened in the world of privacy and data collection, was we didn't see the absolute explosion in the use and exploitation of social media. So we talked a tiny bit about MySpace, and there's one reference to MySpace and one reference to Flickr in a report, which is just unbelievably shocking now, considering that it was quite a kind of groundbreaking report at the time. You know, Facebook wasn't a thing. People weren't putting loads of stuff out there. And we had been talking an awful lot about how can we allow people to be anonymous? How can we allow people to keep their anonymity? And in the intervening time, people seem to have thrown away anonymity. You know, we have social media, which has gone from being avatars and kind of made-up names to Facebook, which is based on your identity, your picture. Twitter is absolutely based on your identity. You want to be based on your identity. That's its value. It gives you profile. We were worried about Tesco Clubcard, whereas people, you know, share information about the most personal aspects of their lives quite openly. We were worried about Oyster tracking where you are, but obviously people on Facebook are tagging themselves, locating themselves, telling other people where they are all the time. So actually, this really sort of the area where society and technology really came up against each other, we hadn't seen how much of an effect this would have. What we did say, though, however, is that can we create a world where we have lots of, not one big brother, but lots of little sisters? And maybe that's what we've got through social media. We've got lots of communities where people share information in a kind of guarded way with certain rules about how it's collected and keep information in little pockets that's not networked. But it's not like that either, because people subvert even those possibilities. So, for example, one of my favourite sources of amazingly shocking kind of anecdotes about privacy is my Facebook group, Crystal Palace Moms, which I can tell you is 3,000 women across southeast London who share information so personal, it's literally gynecological at times. It's really amazing. And so whilst that's closed, people are telling 3,000 people who could just be on the street outside their house amazingly personal things. We have technologies like Snapchat. We talked in our report about how about an opportunity to share information in such a way that information will be kind of destroyed after a short time, so you don't have to worry about the future. But of course, we've got new apps that allow you to save the photos from Snapchat, and of course, those have been hacked and leaked. So whilst we could keep the boundaries of privacy there, through social media, we still keep breaking them down. So what do we say? Have we given up on privacy? I don't think we've given up on privacy, but what we've done is we've created a set of even harder dilemmas. Back when we wrote a report, we saw dilemmas, the dilemma of choice between giving away data and getting benefit for that, either from buying things on Amazon or creating a network or creating a community on social media, but also losing sort of control of your personal data. But I kind of slightly disagree with Phil. You have choices to whether be on Facebook or to be on Twitter, but it's really hard not to. There's so much joy, there's so much kind of pleasure in being on social networks, there's so much of culture and access to cultural material is through kind of things online where you have to give away your browsing details to access it. So it's really hard to say no to sharing, and therefore it's really hard to resist the risks. And that's at a personal level. And at a societal level, we're really torn between two major pushes. We've got the desire to sort of keep things secret, to not have government have all the information about our phone records. But on the other hand, we want information about government. So we've got Edward Snowden on one side, but we've also got WikiLeaks on the other. We've got this big dilemma about what do we want? Do we want transparency? Do we want lots of access to data, or do we want privacy? So we haven't given up, but we've made it really, really hard to come up with an answer on how we do protect privacy.
Thank you, Natasha. Bill.
In a more slightly abstract vein, following on from Natasha. And I think the title's quite apt, the drip by drip, because in my experience, it's often drift that brings down individuals, institutions, and even potentially societies, rather than sudden shocks, as everybody, particularly in the security world, seem to be particularly obsessed with. And monitoring cultural transformation on a steady, day-by-day basis is actually quite important in this. But in that regard, I think it's important to situate legislation like DRIP and say that actually it is a consequence of cultural change and cultural transformation, rather than the cause. Now, we've heard already that there's clearly a great deal of cultural confusion about privacy. On the one hand, people feign outrage, and no doubt there's some legitimate outrage when they get revelations about the NSA from Edward Snowden, or maybe at a less intellectual end, celebrity nude photographs are leaked into the media. But at the other end, as we've just heard, people are quite happy to disclose incredible amounts of their own private data on Facebook and other media. And I think more importantly, they also accept the government prying into their lives around themes such as privacy being the realm of potentially domestic abuse. That's something that people don't really consider when they're looking at this debate. But actually, most of you in this room probably think, oh, well, that's quite reasonable that the government should be looking into that. Or, for instance, this year, I think there was the introduction of Clare's Law, which allows partners to ask the police whether their partner has got a criminal record in relation to, being a sexual predator or something else, which is also a remarkable infringement of privacy at one level, which most people think, well, that's probably reasonable. So you've got this confusion. I just wanted to actually take us back one step to something that you probably think is really obvious, but I think needs spelling out, which is the importance of privacy for human beings to develop and flourish, and for a healthy public sphere and a public realm where we can debate ideas such as this. I often start some of my courses by pointing out to my students that I'm not one of those professors who wants to introduce a code saying we must not offend one another in the class, but the only code I would have is please don't tweet or put it up on social media, because we are trying to experiment with some quite challenging ideas. And of course, if it's going to be broadcast, people will clam up and they won't be offered the opportunity to experiment and to develop. So that's an important area. Privacy, of course, is a refuge. You wear a mask in public life, and at some point you want to be able to retreat to an area where you can remove the mask, or indeed, if you're playful, put a different mask on. It's a source of reflection, which allows you to develop, and also, as we've heard, an important realm for private communication to build up relationships of trust. In other words, it's neither good nor bad, but necessary. And now, whilst everybody probably in this room will affirm the importance of privacy at the level of rhetoric, I think what's interesting is that it's continuously denigrated and eroded at the level of practice. And technology is often talked up as the threat within all of this, but technology simply facilitates intrusions and exposures. It's not the real driver. And neither, by the way, do I think business is the primary driver, or the media, or government. I don't know of any public official who wakes up in the morning thinking, how am I going to intrude in people's private lives today? That's not how they think about these things. Rather, all of these social actors, technologists, businesses, media, and government, are responding. They're responding to a powerful cultural script that consistently devalues and pathologizes the private sphere. The private sphere has been continuously represented, particularly in Western culture, as a site of abuse, for instance, in relation to children, women in the home, and the elderly, or a site of exploitation and violence, exploitation through market forces and government, or things like bullying. So, whilst externally government may get fixated on terrorism, and this is probably the only reference I'm going to make to terrorism today, on the outside, we've got to remember that there's an army of therapeutic professionals, counselors and coaches, who are continuously demanding the exposure of what they call toxic relationships on the inside. And that doesn't get included in this discussion on privacy. And I think that's actually part of the contextual stuff that you need to understand. The consequence is that the private realm is seen as highly problematic, and government and others are demanding continuously the need for openness and transparency about what you get up to in private. So Michael Gove gets caught out because he's suspected for his communications, which he held not using his government email address, but a private email address. And of course, if you're doing it in private, Michael, it must be even more suspect, and therefore we have to have it exposed into the public domain. Brooks Newmark, I think vaguely tongue-in-cheek mentioned by Jim earlier, took openness a step too far. He obviously took this need for openness and by texting his private parts to somebody. And aside from immature members of parliament, I do think there is a concern for young people who themselves may not know the boundaries between the private and the public. I'll just finish with this. I think the over-focus in general in this discussion on technology is problematic because it misses where a lot of intrusion into your private life occurs. The Snowden revelations actually didn't explain anything. Yeah, they simply confirmed people's pre-existing prejudices or fears, but they have no explanatory potential. Likewise, the state has become blinkered. So my area of study has shifted from being people trying to understand it in social, political, and cultural terms to government saying, well, look, the best thing we can do is monitor the individuals concerned in order to try and predict their behavior and prevent it. But what are you preventing in the long run if you don't seek to understand it? No doubt, private life does have many problems and negative experiences, but that's no reason for eliminating it. And my final point is, we actually have to reclaim that importance of privacy for us all to develop if we're going to have a healthy public discourse in relation to issues like Snowden or anything else.
Can we thank all our speakers for some excellent... some really excellent kind of initial thoughts and subtle initial thoughts. And I think this is actually quite a difficult and subtle issue. And I guess what I'd like to do, I'm conscious of time, but I'd quite like us to try and draw out that line that we're trying to navigate between privacy, regulation, I guess. But I'm interested in, I guess, something that Bill has said, which makes me reflect back on some of Phil's initial points. Phil talked about the importance of consent and safety, but also of transparency online. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about the transparency issue and what that means. And in respect to the idea that actually, oftentimes we think transparency is about holding power to account, but actually we might, make government quite difficult if everything is transparent, if everything that government does is thrown out into the world. So, does government not also need privacy if it's going to govern and control?
Yeah. I think privacy, certainly for me, is something that human beings need, not institutions. So yes, again, you have to sort of slightly deconflate it. Human beings in government need to work things out. And not all secrets are good, but lots of secrets and some secrecy is necessary. Yeah? So I wouldn't say if it's about individual people, the Michael Gove example, we don't know. We are suspicious because we are inherently suspicious of our politicians. But in terms of transparency, I think it is a rebalancing thing. And the institutions are fearful of it, but when they actually go through the pain threshold, if you like, it actually forms the basis for a more reasonable, rational, equitable relationship. So, for example, in the course of the campaign we've been running on our medical records, people didn't know, for example, that the police were going on a regular basis and checking out where people were through something called the National Back Office of the NHS. But that out into the open, now we can talk about it, it's a mini sort of Snowden-esque type revelation, has forced them to look at the process and say, okay, well, we have to explain what we are doing, why we're doing it, in what circumstances we do it. We can now actually put ethical controls on it, oversight on it. And, transparency, though it causes pain, actually can help us to shift or negotiate the new acceptable practices that we're talking about. Without that transparency, without that information, we haven't got the basis even to know how unbalanced things are. So I take your point, that you can't sort of, just sort of say, transparency across the board, everything transparent, governments must be completely, can't have any sort of private space. I think that's going too far. But it is a tool applied in a, in a sensible way that can redress some of the imbalances that have built up simply through people being too used for years to saying, trust us. It's for your own good. Yeah, and in the health context, it's actually, trust us, it's good for you. You know, so we've got to get a better place.
That kind of feeds in. I've got a couple of questions, but feel free to kind of come back on any of this. Just tell me if you want to respond. But I was interested in something that Jennifer brought up, and some of the other panelists have touched on it. I mean, I guess the idea of what we're going to call informed consent. You know, the problem that we don't necessarily know enough to consent to, or to know what we're doing when we give away our data. I mean, there's something really troubling in that. I get it entirely, but then, so who do I trust to let me know what I can and can't give away? Because then it seems like maybe do I then need to trust Stephen? And I'm sure Vodafone people are lovely, but you know, we wouldn't be having this discussion without them. Of course you're lovely. But at the same time, am I now trusting my privacy to you? And therefore, is that not in and of itself undermining my privacy? It's not really a question, but do you see what I mean? What do we think? How do we navigate that?
I think one of the problems with privacy is that it actually has never been defined. And it means different things to different people, and it means different things to different people in different contexts. And very often, you're perfectly happy with what you're doing until something happens and you realize that your privacy has been violated, that someone has perhaps sent on a photograph that you sent them, something like that it's not even within your control. So it's not something that we've all got a clear idea about to even start talking about an issue that we all understand and agree on. And I think it's difficult to leave it all to politicians who don't have the technical expertise, you know, to perhaps make laws that are relevant. Some scholars have said that our laws are based, actually should all be reviewed because they're based on an assumption that we can anonymise data, and that is not the case now. And as technology develops, it won't be the case in the future. So actually our laws are outdated by technology, as Stephen said.
Yeah, no, Stephen and Natasha both touched on this. Stephen, what do you
I was just going to disagree with Jennifer about the lack of a definition of privacy. There's a million definitions of privacy. There's so many definitions, you just take your pick. I actually think we spend too much time worrying about the definition of privacy. I think it's a real problem, and certainly in my area, in the legal area, it's been a huge block to more creative thinking around the problem and looking at it in its broader social context. But I was going to come back to your point, Bill, about trust and kind of consent. And obviously consent is a really important part of sort of self-determination and autonomy, but let's not overburden it, because there's only so much time in the day, and you really don't have enough time in the day to consent to everything that's done with your information. So it has to be preserved for a very small set of things where you genuinely can exercise some meaningful choice and you're prepared to do so. For everything else, there has to be something else. And it comes back to this point about trust and trusting institutions. And I can reflect what Phil said about trust, that trust is something that's earned. It's not something that's given as a matter of blind faith. So whether you're a public institution or a company, you have to earn that trust. And you earn that trust through transparency and through accountability and through your behaviour being, and your promises being reflected in the behaviours that you deploy. So, you know, consent and autonomy and choice has a role to play, but it has to be very carefully preserved to things that you can genuinely exercise choice. And for everything else, you know, companies, institutions have to be able to demonstrate through behaviour and through shining a spotlight of transparency on what they do, to demonstrate that things are being done in the way that has been agreed, has been set out in the law, as you would expect.
Okay, thank you. Natasha, any?
Yeah, I think the issue of consent is really important, one of the issue of informed consent, because the problem is that so many agreements that we enter into when we give data away are just almost impossible for the average person to understand or engage with, and it's like you don't have the time to do it. But one of the issues is that we do sometimes give consent. We sort of tick boxes, or we say we don't mind things happening because we want the service. But in actual fact, you know, we aren't consenting because we just don't know what we're doing. We're just doing it really quickly. It's in the moment. We might be giving away something that, you know, in perpetuity that we just do at one moment because we really need to buy something and it's our lunch hour and we haven't got time to read the agreement. And that worries me because it's known that that's how people make decisions. So it's, you know, it's a false consent, and it's almost kind of problematic that you're even being asked to agree to something when you can't possibly be agreeing to it in a sort of self-conscious and understanding way. So that is one challenge, I think, of the way we give away data.
Could I go back on that?
Go on quickly, yeah.
Just quickly.
Yeah.
So that's partly, and the reason why that happens is partly because companies have been trained by a regulatory regime which makes that the path of least resistance. It's a nonsense. You know, people don't read these things. They don't really understand what they're doing. But regulations kind of force companies through a very kind of legalistic interpretation of what they should be doing to get this way through, because it's the quickest way to get forward with the least amount of risk. But it's not the right way to do it. And I agree with you. It's not consent at all. It's just a sham.
How do you respond? I mean, I'm just interested, Bill, in that idea. You've kind of said the onus needs to be focused back upon us to take control of privacy. There is a problem if we can't take control of privacy, if we don't have time in the day to take control of privacy, if we don't understand the legalese of all of these things. So how does that?
Well, I bring it back to the problem is a broader one than we're examining here specifically. So the issue of loads of regulatory boxes that you tick to agree, I agree this on the software I've just downloaded, and there's 3 pages, and obviously you haven't read it, and some wags in Canada took a thing out on the street where people agreed to give their children away. But that's, you know, that culture emerged because of obviously a lack of engagement between us and our political leaders that is quite a recent phenomenon. So actually I think Phil is wrong when he says we are inherently suspicious. I don't think we might be, you know, it might be good to be critical, but being inherently suspicious, I think, is a recent phenomenon, and we need to situate that within a particular, you know, historical period and understand why it came about. I also think the other red herring in this discussion is the focus on information, because information is only half of what you need for intelligence. And the reality is it's how the information is interpreted and through what particular analytical framework you interpret the information that really matters. And as it happens, number crunching doesn't do that. So I can tell you I'm flying to Istanbul tonight, and that means many, many different things. It means, you know, what it says on the tin. It means I'm going on holiday. It means there's a business opportunity there. It means I'm joining the Islamic State group. It means it's code for we're breaking into the bank tonight. It means I've made a mistake. I'm flying to Ankara, actually, but I just got it wrong. And, you know, in order to understand that piece of information, you need to know who I am, you know, the tone of voice through which it's said, who the recipient is, and a whole series of contextual stuff that cannot be accessed by downloading your data.
Okay, thank you. Over to you guys. Who'd like to round this all up and make it all make sense for us?
I'd like to go back to your idea of Bill's point about the suspicion of privacy. Something that no one's mentioned on the panel, and I'm slightly surprised actually, is that there's Tor, the onion ring. So if I want to be private, and if I want to buy drugs on Silk Road, I'm going to do it on Tor. But because I might be buying drugs if I'm on Tor, I'm suspicious about whether I should go on Tor, because does somebody know whether I'm on Tor?
If you look at the new data protection regulation that's been discussed in Brussels, the problem there is that it actually problematises even further the relationship between companies and individuals around how data is used. And so what's been suggested is that there's a much more onerous obligation on companies to get informed consent. But actually the point is that when companies provide services, they inevitably have to process an enormous amount of personal data, not for commercial reasons, but just for operational reasons, to be able to provide the service. And the last thing you want as a consumer is to constantly be asked, do you agree to this, do you agree to this, do you agree to this? Because obviously it's meaningless. The point is you trust the company to provide you with the service that you want them to provide you with, and if you're unhappy, you move on and use someone else. So it's important to understand that the political class or the legislature at the moment are not really coming to grips with thinking through what that means in terms of looking at the question of trust and how to look at that in the future. And having a quick look backwards, if you look at Ripper, I'm concerned, just as a human, that Ripper, I can't believe, well, I now agree with David Blunkett. So Blunkett, that well-known libertarian, made the point that he couldn't believe how much Ripper had been used since he first passed it, or he was the Home Secretary that put it into force, on the basis that he couldn't believe, A, how much activity takes place under Ripper now, which is all automated, so there's no legalistic or interpretation that takes place at a human level. Several 100,000 requests for information get sent to communication companies every year, and it's all automated. Vodafone, E, everyone, BT, it's all the same in the way that information is processed. But that's a much higher number of requests than was ever imagined when Ripper was first passed to deal with serious crime and terrorism, and those being the legal basis upon which one might intercept a communication. Is it really the case that 700,000 requests a year are justified on that basis? And when you look at how it's now been abused to look at journalistic sources, then look at DRIP and look at the enormous amount of data that companies are now being required to hold on their customers. Is this a good thing? In that sense, It's a real lack of leadership in the House of Commons or politically to say, we think Ripper got out of control and we should look back at Ripper and see what we're really trying to do here. And are they really going to extend Ripper to social media platforms in the way that you described? Can that be done? Can you get WhatsApp in there? Can you bring Twitter in there? Can you put Facebook in there? And that's going to happen because you can see the EU recently got social media platform providers into the European Commission to ask them precisely that question. And it's something that we should be having a discussion about. Do we really want companies to be under that level of obligation? Because then what would happen to our data in that context?
To comment on 2 points. First one relative to the progression of data and privacy, the idea that privacy is going to become more difficult in the future. It won't be possible to keep data private. I think there's reasons to think that that's incorrect. So likewise, I guess it dovetails with the idea that nothing positive or nothing new or nothing explanatory came from the revelations of Edward Snowden. So quite the reverse. One thing that we did learn, one kind of bit of good news from all of this, is that it was a revelation just how little success the NSA have had cracking encryption algorithms, how little success they've had subverting Tor. And that's something which no one expected. There was a wide assumption in the security community that most of the major encryption algorithms had been compromised in some sense, that Tor was a kind of front for NSA snooping, and quite the reverse. So in the future, and we're only just getting started, it's quite possible to arm yourself against snooping. I think the Snowden revelations stand as testament to that. In answer to the question about Tor, we know that Tor hasn't been compromised, and we know that, try as they might, the NSA have had amazingly little success. The answer to the question of do I attract suspicion because I use Tor? The simple answer is that everyone used Tor. That's it. The more people that use Tor, the quicker it gets. And so in the same way that the internet is new, these issues of security are nascent. There are very few people who set out to develop a totally private system, but this is really gathering pace, especially with Snowden's revelations. And I can tell you that the NSA and GCHQ are collectively, they're just apoplectic about it, because things were difficult when people weren't militant about their privacy. Now things are going to get much worse for them. So a ray of light for advocates of privacy there.
Since the early 90s, when I started thinking, why is everyone talking about privacy all the time, when it used to be about free speech in the media? Now it's all about privacy and gossip, and what's that about? What seemed to start to happen wasn't, I'm sure in the sort of social work arena, there was this real discussion about toxic relationships, and that effectively allows the state in, if one agrees that that's the case, to family life. But in other areas of society, there was also a sort of collapse of ideology, a collapse of ideas. Even feminism was drying up. There was the collapse of the walls. There was, communism was dead. The end of history, someone wrote as a title for a book. And what did politicians do here? They became touchy-feely. And what does that mean? They started talking about their emotions, the people's princess, all of that kind of thing. And effectively, the media sort of pushed that as well, and then reflected that by opening up, by going after people's private lives. Not always in a moralistic way, oh, someone's having an affair, but simply almost for the sake of it, because politics was dead, so how do you fill the front pages? Well, all the other stories about personal life and emotion.
I think there's just one distinction which I'm surprised no one's really made. When you mentioned that on the one hand we might worry about government snooping, even though we give away all this information on Facebook, Facebook can't arrest you. I think that's an important distinction to make, and why people might feel much more uncomfortable about government snooping than just the fact that a lot of their information is online. When you go on an online service or social media, you expect a certain contract. You expect that maybe I've given my information to you, maybe I've given it out to a lot of people, but I don't expect them to come and knock on my door later on. I don't expect to have my door kicked down because I might have said something that triggered the wrong sort of search algorithms or something. I think it's very important to understand that distinction, that the government has the monopoly on legitimized violence and Facebook does not.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. I just can say that there is another side to that, though, which is not just about the government. I share your concern that I should be a bit more concerned about the government, perhaps, than Sainsbury's or about Facebook. But in my kind of day job as a teacher, we've recently come across a phenomenon that, particularly in the US universities are very likely to look at what their applicants are doing on Facebook in order to decide whether they're going to get a place. So, Facebook might not come and arrest them for what they're doing, but they might well miss out on the university place. So in that sense, the self-exposure and the revelation is actually still quite an interesting and potentially problematic issue.
Very interesting. One of the speakers, I can't remember who it was, raised the question of young people and their perception of privacy and their understanding of privacy and the distinction between that and the public. And it seems to me that actually it's a broader problem than young people, that how can we achieve any of this? How can we get the correct response to terms and conditions or security or whatever, unless we have a cultural understanding of privacy? This society understands how it wants to value privacy, what privacy actually means. And so take the example that the chair's just raised about young people and employment opportunities. Well, I'm working in a school. They increasingly be told about this, and they can sort of switch on to the idea that employers look at Facebook. Why should it be socially acceptable for employers to look at Facebook? You know, yes, you shouldn't be stupid enough to post yourself up there or let someone post yourself up drunk, but why in our society do we think it's acceptable to work for somebody who looks at your pictures on Facebook? So I think we've got a much bigger problem about how we as a society understand and value privacy.
Yeah, I find it frustrating that the things that we get excited about in terms of privacy and the things that we don't get excited about. So I would say if you're a right-thinking person today, you might get excited about Tesco club cards. Right? You might get excited about Snowden or CCTV. I think if you ask the same right-thinking person about abuse, this is bringing it back a bit to Bill's point. So if you say to a right-thinking person, there is a problem of strangers, their likely reply will be, no, there's not. The problem's in the home. And that's become an accepted sort of mantra for right-thinking people, that you're enlightened to realize that abuse is in the home. Of course, implicit in that is the idea that we need somehow to police private relationships. And Bill mentioned domestic violence. And again, right-thinking people probably think the increased policing of domestic violence is a positive thing. Well, in Scotland, I can tell you, I've got a master's student now doing research on this. Stephen House is now Sir Stephen House, the head of the police. And he has made domestic violence one of his golden threads. And the nature of the policing of domestic violence, I think, is extremely problematic. So while all other violent crimes are going down, domestic violence as a crime is rocketing. But that's because of policing. Now, historically, anyone that was radical would have raised a question about the criminalization process that's taking place here. Whereas today, right-thinking people are probably cheering Stephen House to the rafters. That, to me, seems a problem.
Okay, thank you. So who wants to speak? Particularly, I guess, this issue that's been raised, that maybe, in a funny sense, we're having the wrong discussion, that the problem isn't a problem in terms of data or regulation. It doesn't, that's not where the problem starts, and therefore it's not going to be solved there. Natasha, and then Bill. Yeah.
So I'm a philosopher, so I like talking about values and I like talking about definitions. And I think going back to this concept of Tor, the cliche about privacy is if you've got nothing to fear, you've got nothing to hide. Therefore, if you've got something to hide, you must have something to fear. But that's partly because part of our concept of privacy overlaps with the concept of what's secret and what you want to do in secret. And so actually we have this social concept that some things are private because they're bad, and if they're not bad, then they shouldn't be private. So we do have to kind of start unpicking privacy from secrecy, from anonymity, from confidentiality, and get what we value and what we're worried about, separate them out a bit. And I think that's why we do have to have this discussion about the wider social values, because we just can't develop good regulation that meets people's needs unless we have a better understanding what our values are and what parts of privacy we value, what parts frighten us to a certain extent.
Okay, Bill.
Well, just quickly on that point about the rise of domestic violence. I mean, it's not just greater policing, it's a changing meaning of the words domestic violence. So, if you're surveyed and say, has your partner ever raised his voice or her voice? Yes. But, we've probably in this room all experienced that. And it depends, on your sensitivities and how you're encouraged in your sensitivities as to whether you decide that that's a report-worthy thing. Tragically, the human mind is extremely prone to the power of suggestion. We live in a culture that's constantly suggesting abuse, and we discover a lot of abuse. One very quick thing on Snowden. I mean, if there's a revelation at all, and it's not a revelation, it's the extent to which our national security is being outsourced. So it's like national security is just like any other business now. They outsource to contractors. Now, one would have thought, and one would have hoped that it's a different process with different standards for achieving a sense of loyalty.
Okay. Stephen.
So I also want to talk about Tor as well. I think let's imagine that Tor was this impenetrable way of communicating, and we were all using it. Would that be a good thing? And would it be a good thing if it could never be penetrated by the police or those who needed to penetrate it? So, I mean, the solution to this problem is not one kind of locked up in technology, and there are many people talking about technology as the answer. It absolutely is not. Because privacy has to be valued against other issues and other needs in society, protecting kids and domestic violence and all these other things, all to be worked out in their own particular way. The trouble is, though, is that we're really rubbish at valuing privacy. In fact, every discussion about privacy privacy is balanced as an individual need against a massive societal value of protecting the state against terrorism and these big bad things that could happen that could blow you up and kill you. And that's a completely wrong way of looking at it, because privacy is a societal value. As Bill alluded to, and as Glenn Greenwald was saying on his recent TED presentation, privacy is essential to freedom. If you can't do things in private, you cannot challenge authority, you cannot think outside of existing structures, it's difficult to innovate. All of these things that we value in a liberal society are essential things that privacy enables. And we don't look at it in the context of privacy is something that society needs to function against security and safety and all these other good things that need to happen, and valuing them appropriately.
Okay, thank you. Phil?
I completely agree. I go even further. I mean, privacy is recognised as a fundamental human right. Yeah, Bill said how it's necessary. I don't think anyone here is denying it, but as recognised as a fundamental right, not just a need, something that is absolutely essential to our development. How have we got to a point where seeking privacy is becoming an almost criminalisable activity? I mean, this is the thing. The gentleman who mentioned Tor. If you seek to do something, if you seek that private space, okay, admittedly using that technology, but if you seek to associate with others and exclude the state or others, you're seen as inevitably you are the bad guy. And I think that's not the technology. That's an attitude in society that we really have to combat. The other side of it is to presume that not to share is bad. Yeah, and there's a very worrying narrative coming through, certainly around things like our DNA, our medical records, and the stuff that I'm involved in. That if you don't share this stuff for the greater good, then you're a bad citizen. Whether this is a response to or a symptom of, I tend to think this is some long-term agendas by people who see the immense value locked up in medical information, which can be converted into vast amounts of money, fear marketing, and what have you, selling drugs to healthy people who don't need them, possibly even, on the basis of something we found buried in your genes, a propensity to something. So we are going to need to actively prevent people as a society from looking deeper and deeper into our private places, and this cannot be seen as an antisocial act.
Okay, thank you. Jennifer, any quick responses?
I just think there's a very divided society in how we use technology, how we understand it, levels of understanding, levels of use. As I say, young people didn't realise that they were being profiled. I have been looking at this for the last 3.5 years, and I was saying to Natalie earlier, I can't remember what I didn't know now. I sort of wonder what people who haven't been looking at privacy, how they feel about it.
Many, many years ago when I was doing research in the Caribbean, my thesis was basically on gossip, and I like this analogy of social media and gossip. In the village there was a series of incidents where young men who had nothing better to do would roam around in the evening and during the night and listen to what was going on, and they would write on the shop door overnight what was happening, and they called it the Daily Everything. And what is happening here is a much bigger expansion of that kind of hacking or invasion of privacy. And so it's a nice analogy about people being judged on what is known about them and reputation, and it also acted as a form of social control. What worries me, and this is an extension of that now, is not so much what the authorities know about me, but what people who are not in authority know about me, and this whole process of hacking, which we know is a very a burgeoning criminal activity. And I've recently had my emails hacked, and it's a very unpleasant experience, and I wondered if any of the panelists would like to comment on that.
I was at an event the other day where BT was saying they hold all sorts of data, not just on what you do, but where you are and at what time you do it, and they can co-reference that with someone else's data and draw inferences about the nature of the relationship, what's going on. So there's lots of derived data, which makes it difficult to understand what you're signing up for. So how do we deal with that? And then I just want to throw a further thing in there, as we're moving to an era of the Internet of Things, where it's not just what you do on your device, but things such as sensors that are going to be embedded in everything that are watching what we do. Who gives consent, and how does your data get protected in a world where you're not even involved in making any decisions to grant authority? Data is being collected about you in time and space, and inferences being drawn from that, of course.
I think I want to make a strong support for Bill's point that, okay, the focus on the spooky state which collects data and all the sort of technological is important. But I think his point, and supported by the man over there as well, is we shouldn't underestimate the extent to which we have pathologized the private realm, our own, not just our own intimate relationships with children, with partners, whatever, but with ourselves. So we have a situation where our own privacy is completely eroded by the idea that our own psyches, our own psychological problems are harmful to ourselves and need state intervention. And that's leading to a growing array of interventions in things like mothers and children's attachment behaviour by primary school teachers, young people's supposed vulnerability to extremism by secondary school teachers. So we are a bit of a sitting duck when a whole load of our privacy we are willingly surrendering in the name of those sorts of measures, a part of this discussion as well.
Okay, thank you all. This has been a really stimulating discussion so far, and there is too much on the table. So, Phil, just your final reflection.
I just want to pick up, because it was something I was going to say. This derived data point is actually very important in terms of the transparency stuff you're trying to pick up on. You know, we might know what data we have surrendered to someone, you know, and we might even have access through freedom of information or whatever, you know, to find out what information someone knows about us. But that is basically irrelevant if we don't know the secret algorithm that governs the decisions that are being made about us. And for me, I'm more worried, not so much by, you know, except about certain classes of information about people. I'm worried about the decision making. I'm worried about the discrimination, literally, and, you know, the neutral term, yeah, as well as the sort of negative connotations of that. Okay. You know, these are systems designed to fix us into categories, and that's abusive of human dignity.
I'm worried now. Jennifer.
Someone raised the issue, several people raised the issue about Tor. It's been referred to as the dark net. People in general will be too frightened to use it. All of us using it may be a solution, but everyone is not going to buy into that, and people are going to be too afraid to use it, if they even are capable of downloading it and using it. So, yeah.
Okay, yeah, so that's not an option for most of us, which includes me, as I'm incompetent. Stephen.
So I also want to reflect upon the derived data point. So that's, in other words, that's analytics. It's the deriving of intelligence from data sets that tell you things about people or groups of people or societies and what have you. And we have a business that does that on an aggregate kind of societal city level, not at an individual level. Because to do that at an individual level, we need to find a way of showing that back to you so you can see what we think we know about you, and you can have a degree of control over that. And that's been something that we've invested 3 years worth of work to do, and we're getting close to being able to put something into the market so we can start to say, okay, data's valuable, it gives us valuable insights into groups and societies, we can find health benefits and transport benefits, but also individual benefits. We can't do that. We can't do that legitimately until we can give you control over your information and you can see what we think about you. But there's a kind of a pervading thought about this whole subject of privacy and technology, which is that we have to give up on privacy because technology is kind of gone. It's gone. The gates open and the horse is bolted and we can't get it back. And I've got no qualification for saying this because I'm not an engineer, but I fundamentally reject that for the same reason that we build buildings and we build cities in ways not just that achieve functional objectives or even aesthetic objectives, but that achieve broad-based social objectives. London was once a smoggy, cramped, horrible place to live. Now it's not quite as smoggy as it was because we choose to make it cleaner. And we have the same power over technology. We write the code, we build the kit. It's entirely in our hands. What we're not doing today is we're not investing enough effort to build technology in a way that reaches social objectives, such as the balance between privacy and safety and all these other values. But I firmly believe it's within our grasp if we invest the right resources and attention in doing that.
Okay, thank you, Natasha. You are our expert on engineering. Final thoughts?
Well, actually, I'm not sure if it is within our grasp. I think this is a classic example of a wicked problem. It's the intersection between people, government, technology, all of which are changing, all of which are moving. There are various values at play, there are various needs at play, and it's a constantly shifting area. So it is exceptionally difficult to come up with policies and come up with technological solutions that give one right answer. There is no one right answer, but what I think is a key area where we need technologists, engineers, and government and society to engage together and to be active and to make decisions and to try and control what they do and to be responsible and self-conscious about what they do. We can't just keep drifting on it and clicking buttons and ticking boxes and hoping that everything will be all right 10 years' time.
Thank you. Bill, final thoughts?
Well, first of all, privacy is not a right. It has to be fought for. And fortunately, there are people like Phil fighting for it. And we need more people involved in that in terms of achieving it. And actually, one good piece of news is the online gaming community seem to have got together because they're sick and tired of being caricatured as murderous rapists by particular layers of society, or latent murderous rapists. And they've decided that actually, no, just because they do what they do behind closed doors and, between themselves, doesn't mean that that's the case. And they're beginning to fight back. And I think it's important that certain groups in society do that. Technology, of course, shapes culture, but technology also reflects culture. And unfortunately, it is at the level of culture that we're going to have to create some kind of transformation. America famously was the land of the free. It's now trying to be the land of the secure. I don't think it's a trade-off. I think actually it's not how much of our freedom do we trade off to be secure. I think security comes through being free, and that has to be achieved in the first place.
Yep.
Can we thank our panel for a very intelligent intervention on this discussion?